Why does Ukraine matter? It matters because Putin is trying to put the band back together. He wants the old Soviet Union back.
Millions of Russians were killed under the communist regime, especially under Stalin. And yet Putin said the collapse of the Soviet Empire was a great tragedy.
Does Vladimir Putin really want to recreate the Soviet Empire? Is that why he's attacking Ukraine? Hard to tell what's going on inside Putin's head. He is one of the most inscrutable leaders the world has ever known. But he does openly admire the Soviet Union, which did include Ukraine and many other countries. When it was dissolved in 1991, Vladimir Putin was a little-known KGB agent just starting his political career. Fast forward 30 years, now a billionaire president who appears determined on recreating the glory days of the USSR.
Тема моего выступления – события на Украине. И то, почему это так важно для нас, для России. Еще раз подчеркну, что Украина для нас – это не просто соседняя страна. Это неотъемлемая часть нашей собственной истории, культуры, духовного пространства. Украина целиком и полностью была создана Россией.
Vladimir Putin has just addressed the Russian people moments ago, announcing what Putin called the start of a military special operation in Ukraine.
Looks like the darkest day has come to pass.
The assault on this sovereign nation, so long expected, has finally come, and everything has changed.
He never recognized Ukraine as a sovereign state.
Vladimir Putin said the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest, not just a great tragedy, but the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century.
Ukraine is hugely important as a sort of historical icon. This is very much the roots of the current crisis.
Defending motherland Russia seems to be his primary objective.
He has much larger ambitions in Ukraine. He wants to, in fact, reestablish the former Soviet Union.
His intention is very clear. To reinstate the Soviet Union.
І так будуть вони йти до Берлінської стіни. Повірте мені.
And if you look at the way Hitler came to power and the way Hitler talked about uniting the fatherland of Germany and avenging World War I, it is the exact same language, it's the exact same justifications that Vladimir Putin is now using.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
Even if a majority of people don't want to sort of live under communism or return to the Soviet Union, they do certainly regret the collapse of the Soviet Union.
His popularity has been declining rapidly. Living standards in his country have been going down. By what right, by what legitimacy does he remain in power? And his argument is that because I'm the one who's going to put the Soviet Union back together again.
Hurrah! We're about to bring in our guests, who are all experts on the Soviet Union in their own way. But just before we do, it's worth mentioning a couple of points. This year, 2022, is the centenary of the founding of the Soviet Union, also known as the USSR, which was established by the Treaty of Creation in December 1922. It lasted for nearly 70 years until 1991 and was led by 8 different men. First Lenin, then Stalin, later Khrushchev, and finally Mikhail Gorbachev. 8 different leaders, but just one political party, the Communist Party. The Soviet Union initially comprised Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Transcaucasia, and would later absorb about a dozen other countries and bits of countries, including East Germany, parts of Poland, and all these other satellite nations. Russia was by far the biggest, most populous, and most powerful, and so the USSR was ruled from Moscow. Ukraine was the second biggest and most powerful. At its peak, 290 million people lived under Soviet rule. For decades, the USSR was in a Cold War with the West. Both sides mistrusted each other and engaged in an arms race. While living standards generally improved in the West, life in the USSR was harsh by comparison. Eventually, after years of negotiations and summits, the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991. Gorbachev, the last leader of the USSR, was credited by many as having ended the Cold War. But last year, on the 30th anniversary of the Soviet Union's collapse, a 90-year-old Gorbachev complained that the West had become arrogant and self-confident after the Soviet Union collapsed and had declared victory in the Cold War. He went on to say the winners decided to build a new empire, hence the idea of NATO expansion. On that point, Gorbachev is correct. NATO has moved ever eastwards, adding 14 new members since the end of the Cold War.
We won't move 1 inch towards the east, they told us in the 1990s. And what happened? They deceived us. They brazenly tricked us. There were 5 waves of NATO expansion, and now missile systems are appearing in Romania and Poland.
It's clear Putin has drawn the line at Ukraine. It's just too important for him for a variety of reasons. A long shared history, including within the USSR, is just one reason. Ukraine also has a large population of 44 million people, around a third speak Russian. And Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe after Russia, and they share a border more than 2,000 kilometers long. So Putin is determined to end Ukraine's NATO membership application, which began in 2008. This is why in December last year, with over 100,000 Russian troops on the border, Putin demanded guarantees from the West that it would not make Ukraine a NATO member.
You must give us guarantees. You must do it. Immediately. Now. We won't be palmed off with decades of idle chatter about the need of security for all, while the other side carries out its own plans.
Well, let's bring in our guest now, and we have Katya Soldak with us. She's a Ukrainian-American journalist in New York, works with Forbes magazine, and has produced a documentary based on her upbringing in the Soviet Ukraine. Ronald Grigor Suny is a professor of political science and history who's dedicated his life's work to studying the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Russia. Allyson Edwards is a teaching fellow on Russian militarism at the University of Warwick. And finally, Marko Gasic is an international affairs analyst who used to work for the Serbian Information Center during the Balkans War. Welcome to all of you. Professor Suny, if I could start with you, please. Many commentators, including the President of the United States, is saying that President Putin is attacking Ukraine as part of a greater effort to put back together the USSR. What do you make of that as an explanation?
Until the actual invasion began on February 24th, I was convinced that this was a matter of getting the West to agree to Putin's security demands. That is, a neutral Ukraine, removing certain weapons from Eastern Europe, possibly renegotiating nuclear arms treaties, and so forth. Now, since that time, and having read his long screeds on history, it's clear he has a sense of danger from the West, from Ukraine, and believes that in a real just world, Ukraine ought to be in some ways linked in a friendly tie of some kind with Russia. But look what's happened. He's getting exactly what he didn't want by launching this unprovoked and terribly brutal war.
So you believe he actually genuinely believes that Ukraine and Russia belong together, and that is as a result of long-standing historical ties and cultural ties?
I think he believes that there is something called Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, Great Russia as they would call it, are part of a single kind of people. He calls it Yedini Narod, a single people. But in fact, he's perfectly aware, I'm sure, that in the modern world, these are 3 different nations. They're recognized by the international order as 3 different states. And yet he's broken all those rules in order to create some kind of great security zone for Russia. His very actions have weakened Russia, driven it out of the international community, and made it a pariah state. Everything
he would have anticipated all of that. I mean, he's been in power for, well, since the turn of the millennium, if you like, so now 22 years. Why now, do you think?
I think he felt that the danger was increasing in some sense, that he had tried for a long time to get the West to agree to his demands about a neutral Ukraine. And in fact, nothing was happening. And then last fall, There were a number of agreements between Ukraine and the United States. There was confirmation that Ukraine would be a member of NATO. The famous Turkish Bayraktar drones were used against the Donbass. So there were a number of provocative events, and he eventually decided to take this drastic and I think terribly mistaken and dangerous step.
Katya Soldak, you grew up in Soviet Ukraine. Let me ask you, is there any sympathy, and if so, to what extent, for Putin's point of view in Ukraine? Any shared nostalgia there for the good old days?
At this point, I don't think that there is any sympathy or nostalgia. Ukraine has come a long way since the times when it was part of the Soviet Union. I lived in Ukraine in the 90s, and I followed Ukraine very closely during its transformation from being just a post-Soviet republic into a wonderful market-oriented democratic state. And between the Maidan revolution in 2014 and today, there were 8 years when Ukraine was at war. Maybe the world did not pay much attention to that, but Ukrainian people have always known during the past 8 years that they are at war, and the enemy is Russia, and the enemy is Putin. And also interacting with people in Russia who were manipulated into thinking that there is a big tension between Ukraine and Russia. Even the human relationships between people became not as wonderful as they used to be when the Soviet Union just collapsed and things were not as tense. And the mood, the sentiment in Ukraine drastically shifted from the idea that Russia is a friendly state and Soviet Union was in some capacity a positive thing. Ukraine has conducted a lot of reforms and a lot of efforts in what it's called decommunization. All the monuments for Soviet symbols like Lenin and other leaders are gone. Streets are renamed. There is absolutely no nostalgia. There is no glorifying sentiment of the Soviet Union. Some older people, of course, you can't change that. That was their childhood and youth, and they maybe remember that in some positive light. But the idea that Ukraine has something to do with Russia, it gradually faded, and precisely because of the past 8 years of the war and Putin's efforts.
Dr. Allyson Edwards, I know you're an expert in how various powers have used history to achieve their aims of today. Can you tell me about the myth-making, as you sort of call it, in Russia by Putin of this relationship between Russia and Ukraine in order to further his objectives today?
Yes, of course. I think that kind of goes back to your first question about whether Putin's trying to take us back to the USSR. And I think Putin's trying to take us beyond that because of this, as Katya said, this non-aligned nostalgia. There is no nostalgia in Ukraine for the communist past. So I think Putin's trying to take us beyond that, beyond the Soviet Union. In his July essay, for example, on the historical unity between Russia and Ukraine, he did highlight that Russians, Ukrainians, and even Belarusians are the one people, share this same heritage and destiny. What we don't know at the moment is how successful this myth-making has been amongst the Russian public, for example. But what Putin said in the July essay is very much some of the sentiments that he then repeated in his February the 21st speech, where he spoke about, again, the genesis of Ukraine, the mistakes of the former political leaders of the communist era, Lenin, Stalin, for example, Khrushchev, giving areas like Crimea back to the Ukraine and stealing it. He frames it as parts of, or these areas of Russia being stolen, not parts of Ukraine, sorry, being stolen from Russia by communist leaders. What we see then on February the 24th is he kind of moves away from this temporal link between Russia and Ukraine relations now and what took place before the communist period. He then starts to speak about NATO aggression, NATO expansion, this idea that after or during the period of the 1980s when the Soviet Union was weak, that the West degraded the Soviet Union and then Russia. And what we can see is Putin moving away from that discourse. There are many threads that are coming together to create some sort of tapestry, something to bring Putin's ideas together. How successful
Can I ask you, about another part of that tapestry. His stated objective was that, he said the military operation in Ukraine was to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kiev regime and to strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine. It came as a bit of a shock to people in the West to think that there was a sizable Nazi presence in Ukraine in the first place, or that there was a genocide going on. Can you tell us a bit about that stated objective, how serious we should take it?
Yes, I think everyone was kind of shocked that this denazification had been used as a justification for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. One of the reasons being is that Zelensky is actually Jewish himself. In addition to that, I think this links back to other wars in which Russia has justified its invasion on the basis of genocide. Namely, one example for me would be the First Chechen War. During the 1990s, Boris Yeltsin, the president at the time, justified Russian intervention in Chechnya because of violence, increasing violence against the Russian population in Chechnya by Chechens. And what we see here again is temporal threads, but of a different kind. This idea that the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine are facing violence and genocide. He notes it as genocide. In terms of
Are any of those claims true?
Not in terms of the Nazi, not in terms of the basis that Putin is bringing this all together.
Can I just switch it over to Marko Gasic for a moment? Obviously, the other three panelists will all agree that these claims by Putin of a genocide or bullying or Nazification of parts of Ukraine are ridiculous. But your perspective, please?
My perspective is that Ukraine is guilty as charged of allowing a very significant extreme right-wing element, Nazis, if you look at their logos, the Azov Battalion, if you look at their leader, Andrei Belitsky, who said, I think in 2016, that the white race should, that he was going to lead a joint project of the white race to eliminate the Untermensch, which were probably others not too far from his borders. But he's clearly a white supremacist. One of his sponsors, I think Azazov, who was the interior minister from 2014 to 2021, was basically supporting his entry into the Ukrainian parliament and defending the Azov battalion, who are out-and-out Nazis. If you look at their logos, their processions, and they're a force unto themselves inside the Ukrainian society and army. They work as enforcers of discipline, or anyone who comes out with anything moderately pro-Russian is going to be for the chop. I mean, there's so much evidence in there if people want to look. It's not enough to say Zelensky is Jewish, therefore there is no problem of anti-Semitism in Ukrainian society. I mean, it doesn't work that way. Ukrainians generally may be a very moderate bunch of people, but they've allowed a very extreme bunch of people to have key positions since 2013 in their society. And I should say that same Belitsky said that of the successful coup at Maidan, which began this problem in 2014. He said if they, that is the neo-Nazis or the Azovs, hadn't been involved, it would have resembled a gay parade, was the way he put it. So that's the kind of a moderate that you've got in the Ukrainian politics, supported by leading Ukrainian politicians. But I don't think the Nazi thing is the important thing. I think the important thing here is that Putin has decided that this is a moment as good as any to address two very dangerous problems. He wants to protect the Donbass population from Kiev, and he wants to protect Russia from NATO. And they're both in some considerable danger. I mean, thanks to the Western meddling of 2013 and 14, a neutral, viable Ukrainian state where people could be more or less anti or pro-Russian, but it would not affect the destiny of the democracy of Ukraine, was overthrown because the legally elected president decided to choose between a EU offer, which effectively was militarization of Ukraine and a small sum of money, and a Putin counter offer of $15 billion, cheap gas and no strings attached. He chose the second offer naturally. He was immediately overthrown, and that antagonized half the population.
Let me take these points over to the panel. Who would like to answer the question about what's going on in the Donbass?
I would like to answer this question.
Yes,
Can
please.
I talk? Okay. Well, I find that repeating Putin's lies on TV, in any panels, is just amplifying the lies that were fabricated on absolutely no basis. I don't know who knows people living in Donbass. I don't know who's been to Donbass. I have a bunch of family living in Donbass, and I can tell you that even after they were occupied by the Russians in 2014, since 2014, nobody was oppressing anybody. Nobody was killing anybody. There was absolutely no genocide. Just because one person is saying that the earth is flat, it doesn't make it a real argument that's worth of
UN
discussion.
Commissioner for Human Rights.
In every country, there is a part of marginal society, including Russia. And in Russia, it's not even marginal. It's very well developed, the Nazi training camps for young people. In every country, including the United States, there is a marginal part of society. And you can never say that that is part of a legitimate government or any kind of threat. If we want to repeat those lies, we need to understand that we are discussing lies and we are trying to argue with something that would be an equivalent of 2 + 2 is 5. It's not 5, it's 4. It's not 3. 2 + 2 is 4. And this is basically the essence of the argument about Nazis and about any kind of, argument that Putin makes.
Your other guest is in a state of denial, I'm afraid, about living atrocities that have been perpetrated on the population of Donbass.
Okay.
The UN themselves estimated that 13,000 people have been killed, mostly on the Donbass side, in the period from the coup to 2021. That includes children, old people, civilians shelled by the central
Marko,
government,
Gasic,
killing its own people.
I would like to pick up on another point. I would like to pick up on another point that you made about NATO, which is perhaps easier for us to observe. Professor Suny, it is a fact, isn't it, that ever since the end of the Cold War, NATO has expanded eastwards towards Russia and is now in the process of looking at Ukraine's membership. From Russia's point of view, that's an enormous neighbor, a very long border, 2,000 kilometers. And the comparison's been made with the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the United States would not tolerate Soviet missiles being put on the island of Cuba. Why on earth would Russia want the same in its backyard?
The arguments about strategic depth, about a buffer state, about a neutral Ukraine, they all had validity before February 24th. But Putin sort of upset the apple cart by that time and made this move.
But his argument would be, I made my demands clear before the attack. I gave you ample warning. You saw all the troops on the border. Yes. You knew what was coming. You didn't take it seriously. I had to act.
He didn't have to act. There was no immediate danger to Russia. There was no provocation from Ukraine. These ideas about Nazis and so forth are completely falsehoods. They don't have any credibility. There are Nazis, by the way, and right-wing fascist forces in my country.
But please stick to the point about NATO. Look, the application by Ukraine to NATO was made in 2008, and it's been accepted. What will happen if Ukraine becomes a NATO member? What kind of military build-up will NATO put inside Ukraine, judging by previous countries?
If that were ever to happen, and that's highly speculative, Ukraine has been invited to join NATO, but there's no prospect that Ukraine will join NATO for the near future. It's an absurdity. Part of the country is occupied. The Ukrainian government doesn't have control over much of the country, and there could have been a negotiated settlement to this, I believe. But the West was very hardline toward Russia. Putin eventually became terribly frustrated and made this, I think, absurd, dangerous move, upsetting, as I say, this proverbial apple cart. He's made the situation worse.
Oh, a final question for you, Professor Suny, because we're running out of time. A final question for you. What would it take to end this conflict? People keep talking about giving Putin an off-ramp. Isn't it just as simple as saying, NATO should just pledge that it will never allow Ukraine to become a member and that it will neutralize the country and demilitarize the country?
I always thought there were two ways to end this, and they were called the Minsk II agreements. And President Macron of France tried to move in that direction. Somehow it didn't work. It's very hard to make that move because both the Ukrainian government and the American government would be seen as capitulating to Putin, who is now the major villain in the world. So it's been very difficult. And now with the war, even more so. I would call upon Western countries to immediately demand a ceasefire and everyone sit down at the negotiating table before we enter the danger stage of urban warfare. We've seen nothing yet that will be like the seizure of Kiev or Odessa or any other major city.
Professor
This is
Suny,
truly tragic.
Professor Suny, Dr. Allyson Edwards, Marko Gasic, and Katya Soldak, thank you all very much for your contributions to the Nexus today. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. Remember, if you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TR2 World. Till next week then, goodbye.